Do I need the lapel or are we good here? We're good? Okay. Bonus points to Rebecca and to Becky this morning for covering and filling in. I don't know what the bonus points are for, but they get them. If you've been with us for the last couple years, which I know is probably not everyone here, we have, over the last couple years, we have worked through the book of Genesis and saw how the world began and the beginning of things. And then we spent several months in the book of Revelation and how things all end. And a few weeks ago, we completed our series in Revelation, and then we did a couple Psalms in the meantime. And now we're going to begin a series this morning in Ecclesiastes. And what I think Ecclesiastes is going to help us to do is not forget Genesis and Revelation. Because if we forget Genesis, like where we've been and how this all happened, and we forget Revelation, where this is all going, the pessimism that Ecclesiastes points to will overwhelm us. But it doesn't have to be that way. And I think we'll argue, and hopefully you'll see this as we go through, that Ecclesiastes is not as pessimistic as its reputation sometimes conveys. So Ecclesiastes is, if you're using a Pew Bible, it is on page 518. 518, you can turn with me. I'm only going to read the first 3 verses because this is an overview sermon. I'm going to cover the entire book in one sermon, and then next week we'll start over again and begin with chapter 1, verse 1, and we'll work through it section by section that way. Ecclesiastes chapter 1, verses 1 through 3. The words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher, vanity of vanities. All is vanity. What does man gain by all the toil at which he toils under the sun? Let's pray. Lord, I pray that your Spirit would guide us as we consider the whole book of Ecclesiastes in one morning, in just the next 45 minutes or so. Give us a grasp of it so that as we work through it from week to week going forward for the next few months, that we can always keep its meaning and its purpose in perspective. Lord, help us to see the wisdom in it and live by it. In Jesus' name, amen. Have you ever had the opportunity to hear an expert in a field that like you're interested in, and you had the opportunity to hear them give a lecture on whatever that was? Like, I don't know if you're a computer guy, which is not me. Maybe you had an opportunity to hear a lecture by Bill Gates. I don't like PCs. I'm a Mac guy, so I would not be interested in Bill Gates. I'd be interested in Steve Jobs, maybe, except he's dead, so I don't know who the new guy is. But if you're like way into finances, Warren Buffett, maybe he's giving a lecture or something like that, you would want to listen to him. One time I had the opportunity to attend a conference, and when I was there, I had the opportunity to listen to actually several people who were, as it were, experts in their fields, and we got to listen to them. I got to listen to John Lennox on apologetics. I got to listen to Os Guinness on philosophy that kind of wandered into apologetics too. And many of you are thinking, like, I don't know this guy, you're a nerd. Yes, that is correct. But at that same conference, D.A. Carson was there giving a lecture, a theological message, sermon, expert in his field, one of the theologians that I admire most. In those cases, it's easy to be in awe of the wisdom and knowledge that those people possess. I mean, they make you feel dumb, but it's kind of in a good way, right? You get to learn from them. Ecclesiastes is like sitting in on a lecture given by one who is an expert in life. And not just one aspect of life, but all of it. And so what we have before us here in this book is something like a manuscript from that lecture that the preacher gave. Or maybe it's at least a transcript or notes someone who attended that lecture they wrote down. And in this lecture, the preacher explains his forays into the most difficult questions of life in search for true meaning in a world that might seem to be devoid of it. Mark Dever has said Ecclesiastes is powerful exactly because it presents the tension and struggle between the teacher's sense of futility and his very real faith in God who is true, between the way things are and the way things ought to be. You know, the title of Ecclesiastes is somewhat strange because it's actually a play off of a Greekish, Latinish word, but it's Old Testament, so it's like Hebrew, so what the world? The Hebrew title for Ecclesiastes is Kohelet. It's the Hebrew word that means preacher, essentially. It's named after the speaker of the book. It means to call or to assemble, and it might indicate, the one who gathers an assembly together to address it, or the one who gathers to give instruction. So you might imagine, a wise sage, a professor, or as the book calls him, a preacher, gathering an assembly together and giving them one of the greatest lectures on wisdom that has ever been given. The title Ecclesiastes comes from the Septuagint translator's rendering of Kohelet. Okay? So what that all means is, you can forget it after I say this, but the people who translated the Hebrew Old Testament into Greek, they translated that word Kohelet into a form of the Greek word ekklesia, which means assembly. Okay, so Ecclesiastes, Ecclesia, you kind of see the connection there. And then that Hebrew word Kohelet then is often translated preacher in our English Bibles. So that's why Ecclesiastes has a somewhat strange title to it and how that got there. Now, do you all feel like you're better people because you know that? Yes. What type of literature is this? Well, I think I've given it away already. It's in the category of wisdom literature, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't have other types of literature within it. So you have proverbs, proverbial sayings, wisdom in there. You've got poems as well, and then there are teaching blocks throughout that form this kind of what we would call discourse, right? These role, this teaching kind of thing. And so what we see here is that the role of Old Testament wisdom, and we're including Ecclesiastes in this, is to reflect commissional theology, right? So in this, we have to think about the creation mandate from Genesis 1, right? Where Adam was given this command to exercise rule and dominion over the earth. And so Ecclesiastes gives us this commissional theology by describing more fully our function as managers of the earth. So in other words, fulfilling the creation mandate does have value before God, even though we have a relatively short time in which to do it, and what we're able to accomplish is often quite limited. Okay, so again, these are all tensions that the preacher is going to deal with, right? The transient nature of things, the meaning of the things that we do, and the very short time in which we do them. Do they all have meaning? So when you think in terms of wisdom literature in general, think of it like this. Proverbs might be for the young man in pursuit of wisdom and maturity and wealth. Job is wisdom for those who have gained it all and then lost it. And Ecclesiastes is wisdom for those who have it and are asking the question, now what? now what? So as we go through this, I'm going to keep a very simple structure, at least for today. I think we can divide this book, again, everything is under debate in Ecclesiastes. If you read 6 different commentaries, you're going to get 6 different opinions. I think I read something like 6 books, the opening stuff at least, and trying to come up with a structure and how this book is arranged. And obviously there were 6 different ones. So I chose more or less the most simple one that I could find and work through and all of that. And so the structure works like this. The first half of the book is actually divided into 2 parts. At least, again, this is the way that I'm seeing it. In the first half of it, the idea is that all is vanity. Okay, simple enough, right? And I think that's the theme through chapter 1, verse 1, all the way to 6, verse 9. But underneath that, though, we've got basically 3 elements. You've got the identity of the person who is speaking here. I think you have a poem from chapter 1, verse 2 down to 11. And then you've got a teaching block which fulfills chapter 1, verse 12, all the way to 6, 9. And so let's work through just these first elements this morning. So again, vanity of vanities, says the preacher, all is vanity. So I think hopefully you can see why I chose that as the main title for this first block. Well, the preacher is the one saying that, so that's what we see in verse 1. So who is that? Now, again, this is debated, so if you listen to what I'm saying and then do your own research, you'll find people that disagree with me. I think that the author, the preacher, the speaker, even though he's not identified as such, is Solomon, King Solomon, the son of David. Okay, so that's what we see in verse 1, the words of the preacher, the son of David. If you look all the way down to verse 12, you will see that the preacher was king over Israel in Jerusalem. Okay, and so Solomon was the only son of David to rule over all of Israel, right? Solomon's son Rehoboam sinned grievously, the kingdom was split in 2. So this, in chapter 1, verse 12, it gives us this idea that, okay, Solomon, the son of David, ruled over the whole nation as one. He is one who, in verse 16 of chapter 1, has surpassing wisdom. That's how he's described. He's got surpassing wisdom. And if you know the story of Solomon, you know that the Lord spoke to him and said to him, ask for something and I'll give it to you. You can be, pretty much whatever you want. And Solomon's request was for wisdom. And the Lord granted him that. And so he is the one who was world renowned, still is, I suppose, for his surpassing wisdom. And then you look on down into chapter 2, verses 49, and you see that this person, this preacher, was responsible for extensive building projects. And again, that fits, that could fit other people, but it does fit the mold of Solomon as well. He was responsible for building the temple, and the most glorious temple that had ever existed, and also his palace, and which he kind of made more fancy than the temple, but whatever. And then all sorts of building projects and stuff throughout the land. So again, you put all of these pieces together, and I think we're on pretty good ground that Solomon is the author here, though some people will disagree, because it doesn't explicitly say. So throughout, I'm going to use the term that the book actually uses, the preacher, right? I'm going to use that term to refer to the speaker, and we'll have in the back of our minds that it's Solomon. And then we come in verse 2 all the way down to 11, is you have this poem, right? It's the vain circularity of life, right? In one of the books that I read, they called it the circle of life, but then I thought that'd be the Lion King in everyone's head, and I didn't want that image, so I chose not to use it, but now I just put it there. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher. Vanity of vanities. All is vanity. So one of the first questions that we should ask, as this poem begins, is what does vanity mean? What does vanity mean? The Hebrew word for vanity is Hebel. Again, we're learning Hebrew one word at a time, whatever. Okay, so you can forget this as maybe soon as I say it. But it's a word that is used, vanity is used 78 times in the Old Testament. Most literally, the word means breath. But there are actually only 3 instances, that would be in Psalm 63, Proverbs 21, and Isaiah 57, where that's the actual literal meaning of the word. That the word breath is intended. Adam and Eve had a son named Abel. Abel's name is identical to that Hebrew word. And we think maybe he was named that because of the temporariness of his life. And that's part of what vanity means, temporary, transient, that kind of thing. But Ecclesiastes uses this word 38 times. So of the 78, 38 of them are in this book. And it's used to convey this sense of transience, the temporary nature of things. It's often supplemented with words like breath or shadow or wind to kind of elucidate that idea. So think of it in terms of going outside on a cold day and breathing in deeply. And when you release your breath, you can see your breath in the form of vapor. But then try to like grab hold on that. You can't because it's gone quickly, and at the same time, it's an impossible task. So oftentimes, as well, in the Old Testament, vanity is used in contexts that relate to attempts at wisdom and attempts at worship apart from God. And in those cases, it describes this act of weightlessness. So worshiping something idea is a weightless thing to do. Meaningless, futility. Okay, that's the idea. And so as we work our way through Ecclesiastes, we'll get the sense that so much in life seems like vanity because of its transient nature. And because nothing seems to last, it becomes really hard to see how anything is valuable and worthwhile. Everything seems to be insubstantial and inconsequential. And further, Ecclesiastes is going to employ the word vanity to convey a sense of perplexity, like describing an enigma, a mystery, something mysterious or puzzling. So, in short, this term vanity, as we're going to see it, it's going to be something like a chameleon. Right? Its base meaning highlights the transient nature of things, but it's going to change its shade to express futility and meaninglessness, perplexity, inconsequentiality. But I think we should be careful because this is where Ecclesiastes gets the reputation of being overly pessimistic. Though Ecclesiastes leads with vanity, it's actually not the word that's used the most in the book. Words like good, wisdom, wise, and God, they're all used more times than vanity. So if you take that into consideration, and you can read Ecclesiastes well then, and you'll realize that maybe this is more positive than it seems. And sometimes the spotlight on the negative serves to reinforce the positive. The preacher is trying to force us to the very end of our pursuit of temporary things, or that pursuit of temporary things just for the sake of the temporary things, so that we will see the positive side. That is, God has infused meaning and purpose into our lives if we can keep the right perspective. As we see in this poem in chapters 1 through 11, Ecclesiastes opens with this reference to like the created order. He talks about the cyclical nature of nature. And in that way, it connects us with Genesis 1 and 2. So God has made everything, the physical creation, time and space, and most importantly, man. And in the beginning, man's life was infused with meaning found in that creation mandate that we talked about. Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it and have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the heavens and over every living creature that moves on the earth. So man is to exercise authority over everything under the sun. And yet, he'll be totally dependent on God to do this. But then Genesis 3 comes, and as a result of the fall, creation, including mankind, has been subjected to this futility, this vanity. Paul says this explicitly in Romans 8, verse 20. So we know why, or we know that the fall is the cause of futility. We know why it exists. Now the cyclical nature of creation is now something of a judgment. You can't get past the fact that everything comes and goes. That sense of futility is then profound in that it creates within us all sorts of insecurities. And then the question becomes, is it worth it? Is it worth it to work underneath this seeming unending and futile cycle? And so the preacher asks, what advantage is there in all one's labors under the sun? That forces us to think about what is meaningful. You know, we often find biblical writers wrestling with their own significance. David asks in Psalm 8:4, what is man that you're mindful of him, and the Son of Man that you care for him? In Psalm 144, 3 and 4, he says, "O Lord, what is man that you regard him? Or the Son of Man that you think of him? Man is like a breath. His days are passing like a shadow." You know what? David often sees the insignificant of man in like spatial terms. Vast universe, and we're so insignificant. Ecclesiastes asks the same questions regarding the significance of man, but in terms of time. Not necessarily the vastness or space. If our lives are so temporary, if they're a vapor or a shadow, how is it that God has given meaning to being so transient? And meaning more so to the transient things that they do. And again, the transient nature of our beings and all that we do could lead to pessimism. And I think in some cases, in severe cases, it even will lead some to depression. So how do we cope or even thrive under these circumstances? What's the point? Is there an advantage to working so hard while we're on this earth? And that's what brings us then to the first teaching block, and this question: what is good for a man to do? What is good for a man to do? And this section runs from verse 12 of chapter 1 all the way to 6:9. This first teaching block is undergirded by the refrain that much of life is striving after the wind. That's, I think you'll see that 6 or 8 times in that particular teaching block. 7. I should read my notes. It appears 7 times. It's the conclusion that the preacher draws at the end of various points that he's making as he teaches through this section of the book. But the interesting thing is that, beginning in chapter 1, verse 14, he says that everything is striving after the wind, and then systematically shows by the end of this section that he has lumped everything into this category. This everything is striving after the wind. And that includes, in this teaching block, things that might be good. Okay. So he'll call out some things that might be good. For example, in chapter 2, verses 2 through 11, he talks about pleasure. All right, pleasure might be good. He says, "I said in my heart, come now, I will test you with pleasure. Enjoy yourself. But behold, this is also vanity." Now, the pursuit of pleasure can be destructive, right? And yet, elsewhere in Scripture, we are told to pursue the pleasures of God. So in that way, pleasure might be evil, vanity. It might be good as well. Another thing that might be good is popularity. You have to go to chapter 4, verses 13 through 16 to see that. There, the preacher speaks of a young, poor youth who rose to ultimate power in the kingdom, but that power didn't last. He concludes in chapter 4, verse 16, there was no end of all the people, of all whom he led, yet those who come later will not rejoice in him. Surely this is also vanity and striving after the wind. I wonder if he had his own father in mind when he wrote that. You think about the case of David. David and Saul, people love David over Saul. But public opinion turned against David too. Popularity can be good, maybe not. But the preacher thinks he also speaks of things that are good. For example, in chapter 2, verses 4 through 11, you have this concept of work. Work is good. Now, some of you might disagree with that. But it was what we were created to do, so it is good. In this section, the preacher talks about the works that he accomplished. He built buildings, he planted gardens and orchards, had a large workforce. He became great. And upon considering all that he accomplished, he found it also to be vanity. Nothing to be gained under the sun. Wisdom, right? Wisdom is good. It seems pretty obvious that we should pursue wisdom. That's a good thing to do. But then the preacher discovers that what happens to the wise and the fool are the same thing. They will die, so what's really the point? Wealth is good. Most people would agree with that. Of course, we would admit there are dangers associated with it, an inordinate love of wealth. But generally speaking, it's a good thing. But the pursuit of this good thing only reveals that he who loves money will not be satisfied with money, nor he who loves wealth with his income. This is also vanity. So the preacher says that the person who makes wealth their ultimate pursuit can never have enough. Therefore, it's a meaningless endeavor. And then the preacher will explore things that are not good. This is one aspect of the preacher's teaching that is readily understandable. It's vain to pursue things that are not good, yet people still do it. Things like oppression, the injustice of those in power using their power to oppress others. Have you read the news lately? Have you seen this anywhere? Things like rivalry, chapter 4, verses 4 through 6. Then I saw all toil and all skill in work come from man's envy of his neighbor. This is also vanity and striving after the wind. This is like the vanity of keeping up with the Joneses. They got a new car, we got to get a new car. They upgraded their house, we got to upgrade. It's that kind of mentality. And so here we have this concept that everything, the possibly good, the good and the bad, it's all vanity under the sun. But then in the middle of this, we find the preacher discussing the concept of time. No one thing is right all the time. And that's what the poem in chapter 3, verses 1 through 8 is all about. There is a season, is the song from the Birds in your head now too? Yeah. There are seasons for certain activities, but what the preacher doesn't tell us is when exactly the time is right for all of those things. So the idea is that there is wisdom in timing. Certain circumstances require wisdom and execution of that wisdom when the time is right, and it's hard to say exactly when that is sometimes. But because of the very nature of our earthly existence, it's hard for us to fully grasp reality. For all of the history books that we have, we must admit that there is not much about the past that there is much about the past that we don't know and we don't understand. is what contributes to the cyclical nature of life. What has been has largely been forgotten, so a new thing comes, but it's not really new. In a few generations, it'll be forgotten, only to be rediscovered by a future generation. That's what the poem in 3:1-8 is all about. There's a season for certain activities. Again, but for all of this talk of transience and cycles, Ecclesiastes does acknowledge that each one of us has a sense of eternity. You see that in chapter 3. And that God then transcends it all. In 3, verse 11, it says, God, we can't know that all that God does, but we can see enough now to know that there's a pattern to it. Okay? And then that's where our faith rests. That gives us confidence for living. So there's one of those hints of optimism that the preacher drops in for us. So this whole concept is like, as we go through this life, we're wandering around in a corn maze. Now, we just took the teens to a corn maze yesterday. Maybe that's why it's fresh in my mind. And there is a big picture to the maze. But when you start the maze and you're inside the corn, all you can see is really tiny. You got like part of the map. That's the whole point of this particular maze. They give you the corner of a map and a star, and you have to navigate to the star, which is a mailbox that has the next piece of the map. And you got to work your way all the way through the corn maze and guess that you're in the right position. We all succeeded. All of our groups succeeded, though some took more circuitous routes than others. Maybe I need to teach on map reading or something like that. It's kind of like life for us. There is this big picture that God has in mind, but we can only see part of it and only parts of it at a time. And we won't see all of it until the end, at least as far as this immediate world is concerned. And then the preacher says in chapter 3, verse 14, I perceived that whatever God does endures forever. Nothing can be added to it, nor anything taken from it. God has done it so that people will fear before him. So that struggle you have with not knowing God's plan, God does that on purpose so that you will fear, you will honor him, respect him. So that brings us to the second half of the book. And the second half is it's all vanity. And the second half of the book kind of works opposite of the first half. Okay, you got another teaching block, and it's going to wrestle with this question of man's inability to know God's work. I think you have a poem at the end. It talks about the youth and old age. And then you get to the conclusion of the matter. Wisdom is to fear God and keep his commandments in the last 4 or 5 verses of the book. But if we look at the second teaching block, and it begins in chapter 6, verse 12. In 6, verse 12, you have 2 questions. For who knows what is good for a man while he lives the few days of his vain life, which he passes like a shadow? For who can tell man what will be after him under the sun? So chapter 7 and 8, they explore that first question, like what is good for a man? Chapter 7 opens with a series of proverbs, It opens with a series of proverbs that explore the benefits of wisdom versus folly. Similar themes are expressed that were expressed in the first section come out in this section as well. But what we find in verse 7 of chapter 7 is the exploration of the inequities of life, at least the paradox of certain situations. God has made both the day of prosperity and the day of adversity. Now, conventional wisdom says that the wise and the righteous should live longer than the foolish and the wicked, but the preacher says that's not always the case. We see biblical example of this, right? Abel and David's friend Jonathan. Two righteous people whose lives were cut short. Chapter 8 continues with this similar line of paradoxical thinking. On the one hand, the wicked will not be delivered by their wickedness. You see that in chapter 8, verse 8. And on the other hand, the wicked man's life seems to be prolonged. And when they die, they're regarded as heroes. Everything seems to be turned on its head. The wicked prosper and the righteous suffer injustice. So what in all of this is good for man to do? Well, that brings us to a point in chapter 8, verse 15. This is the point. Man has nothing better under the sun but to eat and drink and be joyful. For this will go with him in his toil through the days of his life that God has given him under the sun. So in other words, despite the injustices of life and all of its counterintuitive results, it's still good to pursue joy. God gives us the ability to do this. And this idea is punctuated by verse 17 of chapter 8. Then when I saw all of the work of God, the work that is done of the sun, however much man may toil in seeking, he will not find out. Even though a wise man claims to know, he cannot find this out. So this, I think, is the key to understanding the book. Here he equates all that is done under the sun as a work of God. And all of the perceived inequities and contradictions, all of the enigmas and mysteries of life are God's doing, and they have a particular end. But no matter how wise you think you are, you're not going to be able to figure out what God is doing. That's okay. God has still given you the ability to enjoy life. The second question that we saw in chapter 6, verse 12 is explained in chapter 9, verse 1 through chapter 11, verse 6. Who can tell what will be after him? Okay. Who can say what's going to happen after he dies? Now, the answer to this question begins with the exploration of the nature of death. And particularly, it happens to everyone, regardless of their morality. That cold, hard truth brings us to the realization that once we die, we can't control what will happen next. And so what will you do? What should you do? And then the point gets reinforced. And the answer to this question is the same as the answer to the first. Look at chapter 9, verse 7 through 9. Ecclesiastes 9, verse 7 through 9. Go, eat your bread with joy, and drink your wine with a merry heart, for God has already approved what you do. Let your garments be always white. Let not oil be lacking on your head. Enjoy life with the wife whom you love all the days of your vain life that he's given you under the sun, because that is your portion in life, and in your toil at which you toil under the sun. So whatever your hand finds to do, do it with all your might. For there is no work or thought or knowledge of wisdom in Sheol to which you're going. Enjoy life. Pursue wisdom. Recognize that there are injustices in life and work with them. And the reason why you should not get caught up in and be overwhelmed by the fact that you don't know what's going to come after you, what will happen to all of the things you did, your legacy, it's the same reason that answers the first question. You don't know what God is doing, but that doesn't mean you can't have joy. And now we see that chapter 11, verse 5 and 6 runs really parallel with what we saw in 8:17. As you do not know the way that the Spirit comes into the bones of in the womb of a woman with child, so you do not know the work of God who makes everything. In the morning sow your seed, and at the evening withhold not your hand, for you do not know which will prosper, this or that, or whether both alike will be good. You don't know. But just because you don't know doesn't mean that you can't work hard and that you can't enjoy life and that your life can't have real meaning. So even in the midst of our limitations, God has given us the ability to enjoy the labor that he has given to us. God has delivered us from futility. Following this second block of teaching and exploring those two questions, the preacher then moves on to what some people call a poem on youth and old age. And the poem begins in chapter 11, verse 7. It runs all the way to 12:8. I've read this section a few times before in my life, but for whatever reason, it seems to land on me harder this time than it has in the past. I mean, maybe it's because I'm becoming more and more acquainted with old age. The sage wisdom for the young is to remember your Creator while you're young and the joys that he has given to you before you're too old to experience them in the same way. I don't enjoy playing basketball as much as I used to. Now, it's not that I don't like basketball less than I used to. I still like it. It's just that when I jump, I don't jump as high. When I shoot a three-pointer, the basket seems to be a lot farther away than it used to. And I had the opportunity twice in the Philippines to play basketball with the Filipinos. And they invited me to play twice after two of our workshops were done. We went and played at 7 or 8 o'clock at night. And all of those dudes are in their 20s. All these young pastors. Hey, you want to go play basketball? Sure. Man, am I slow. I can't jump anymore. I had trouble making layups, and I realized that it's because I'm not as close to the basket when I make a layup as I used to be. So, sage wisdom, young people. Not just enjoy basketball, but enjoy all of the things that, as a young person, you can do with skill and vigor. Because the time's coming where that's going to go away. And then this poem kind of winds us down to the final conclusion. The conclusion is that wisdom is to fear God and keep his commandments. We see this in chapter 12, verses 9 through 13. Let's read that. Go ahead and turn there. Besides being wise, the preacher also taught the people knowledge, weighing and studying and arranging many proverbs with great care. The preacher sought the words of delight, and uprightly he wrote words of truth. The words of the wise are like goads, and like nails firmly fixed are the collected sayings. They are given by one shepherd. My son, be aware of anything beyond these. Of the making of books there is no end, and much study is a weariness of the flesh. In the end of the matter, all has been heard. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. For God will bring every deed into judgment with every secret thing, whether good or evil. Here we have the purpose of Ecclesiastes. These wise words, this exploration into the enigmas of life are intended to provoke us, to poke us like a goad. The preacher wants to stab us with harsh realities in order to force us to think about this one fact. Judgment is coming. God is going to judge everything that we do. And in that way, Ecclesiastes is a gift of grace, in that it tells us how to live wisely in light of that coming judgment. And so you get to the main point of this book. Judgment is coming. So live wisely in the fear of God. So how do we respond to all this? Well, I think first we should realize that this earth is a bad place to put all of our ultimate investments. If you pursue life as a practical atheist, the preacher is telling you that you're wasting your time, and all that you're doing under the sun is meaningless. I mean, your bank account, your legacy, your accomplishments, vanity. But God in His grace has put eternity in our hearts. That is, He has given us this innate sense to look beyond this life. And that's the perspective that we need to find meaning in our lives. To live in rebellion against this idea is to sin against God and to invite His judgment. And this is where Ecclesiastes pushes us straight to the gospel. I mean, of course, this book acknowledges God. It teaches us about His sovereignty and the accountability that we'll have toward Him. And that serves to point us to this reality that, we've got the rest of the Bible, and it speaks about that all of this, like fulfillment in life, ultimately comes through Jesus Christ. Ultimately, our connection with Jesus is what's going to give this life real meaning. It's what elevates our perspective from under the sun to above the sun. Jesus is the one who, through His life, death, and resurrection, overcame the futility of life. In Him, death is not final. And what we do in this life can have lasting and eternal value. So the call is to turn to Christ in faith. Be delivered from transience, futility, and meaninglessness. And that will set you on the road to meaning, true meaning and fulfillment. And for those of us who are Christians, I think Paul, his word to the Corinthians is our encouragement as well. He says this in 1 Corinthians 15:58, I believe. Therefore, my beloved brothers, be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, knowing that in the Lord your labor is not in vain. Let's pray. Gracious God, thank you so much for the book of Ecclesiastes. I pray that